Chapter 20. The wooden doors slowly creaked open, revealing another world. A world of unmatched magnificence. A world of a wild yet flawless majesty. A stone path running through a tropical paradise. Endless gardens woven with scattered flowers. Orchids and fan palms, lilies and heliconia, vine-climbing banyan fig trees that shuddered through the high night winds overhead. A strange yet alluring ambience laced the balmy air, and Basil's gut told him he had entered somewhere extraordinary and totally uninvited. The wooden door was slammed shut, making him turn over his shoulder until the smells of floral scents tickled his nostrils, provoking him to draw his attention back toward the gardens. "My, oh my," he whispered, inhaling deeply, closing his tired eyes. He finally felt his exhausted muscles relax, and all he wanted to do was to lie down in these gardens.
"Baz,"
Maud murmured, his face obscured in the gentle shadows.
"This is unbelievable."
He ran his fingers along a dewy leaf of a giant red banana palm.
"We're in a dream, surely."
Basil's eyes had that frosted look, becoming engulfed within weird and wacky sounds of the various nightlife. As they quietly meandered along the path, a path now nestled between weathered stone pillars, entwined with delicate night-blooming jasmine, it veered off in many directions to various other areas of the mysterious gardens. Basil glanced over at Maud.
"We've gone from almost getting our bollocks flogged,"
he murmured,
"to this. Ah, the irony of our lives."
Maud turned over his shoulder. They both shared an excited grin.
"Surely, this can't be anything to do with your uncle."
"Well, after today's events, anything's possible." Just who was this Sar to claim? The ambiguity of it all triggered their minds to race with 1,000 crazy thoughts. Surrendering into this fantasy, they wandered through so accidentally. Basil's eyes danced from one direction to another until something else quickly caught his attention. Music. Soft and gentle music. The subtle sounds of a viola drifted through the gardens, flailing up into the starry twilight.
"Do you hear that?"
he asked Maud in a hushed tone.
"Yeah."
The soft glow of the garden light flushing Maud's face for an instant.
"It's sublime. Maybe we died and went to heaven, because this place sure looks like it."
The garden path wound around a corner, and they found themselves confronted with another set of burly guards, sullenly protecting another robust wooden door.
"Oh, you gotta be joking me,"
hissed Maud, eyeing them intently.
"Whatever and whoever they are protecting must be grand."
"So grand," Basil snickered under his breath.
"How many more checkpoints do we need to go through?"
Basil peered straight ahead, spying the guards. "Just keep walking and stop talking." The guards, two on either side of the door, were fervently standing at attention, watching as Basil and Maud neared carefully toward them. More human in size than the first two, these black-bearded guards, dressed as if they had just stepped out from the front line of the Elam revolt of Darius the Great. They donned leather baldricks, draped over their finely woven linen tunics, and their detailed scabbards were holding gleaming silver shamshirs with masterfully crafted golden hilts no less. Without any words exchanged, the saturnine guard stepped aside in faultless unison, and the heavy wooden door slowly opened wide, illuminating an enormously majestic setting that would turn even the most assuredly modest man envious. Euphoria swayed over the haggard bodies of Basil and Maud, who stood on a wide landing before a plunging stairway, cascading like a waterfall into a lavish mezzanine embellished with ancient Byzantine columns and high domed ceilings that were painted with lunettes and frescoes dating back well beyond 5th century BC.
What the?
Mumbled Basil, convinced he was hallucinating.
Welcome,
Spoke an old, well-dressed man, sharing a warm smile that peeked through his graying beard.
allow me to offer my salutations to you. My good name is Alden.
Like the guards outside, Alden's clothes were odd, Basil thought. He too was dressed in a linen tunic and loose trousers, smartly tied with a burgundy silk sash at the waist, and no shoes to speak of.
Hello,
Sputtered Basil, searching for words. Nothing could replace his awkwardness. Alden nodded, understanding wholeheartedly. Finding himself impotently lost within this remarkable place, Basil gazed down the stairs into the grandiose mezzanine that stretched out to meet an endless black sea, as black as ink, lapping along the dark easterly horizon. Its panorama, so beautifully captured with enormous, floor-length glass windows, was a treat to be disposed of timelessly, for whoever was lucky enough to live at such a place. Giving Basil and Maud a moment to regain their composure, Alden patiently stood behind them. He finally put a gesturing hand on Basil's back.
This way, please,
He whispered gently, escorting them from the entrance down the stairway. Obligingly, the two of them slowly tread down, gliding by gigantic colocasia palms, intermingling with a kaleidoscope of draping flower arrangements hanging over the sides of the stone balustrade. The resonance of ancient music continued to passionately drown their ears, serenading them through a palatial quarter laden with precious bronze relics and marble busts. And not a word was exchanged between them, as their eyes cavorted through the luxury of such an unworldly atmosphere. There were simply no words to suffice. Not long after, the tempestuous sounds of women giggling was the only deterrent strong enough to lure Basil and Maud's attention away from their awe. Weaving through giant urns potted with wax palms, the two of them spotted a large, sunken lounge area accommodating several striking women who, to Maud's utter delight, were scantily clad in silken brocade robes, laying lazily on hand-knotted rugs and tasseled pillows, brushing each other's long and glossy dark hair, and drinking and eating from sumptuous platters of exotic fruits and mouth-watering delicacies. Maud gasped out aloud. Hearing him, one of the women immediately looked up, her dark, charcoaled eyes glancing in his direction as she slowly pulled a wooden comb through another woman's hair, equally as delicious, with her full breasts falling through the front of her robe. It wasn't before long that Maud had fallen prey to her seductive spell. She subtly nudged another woman lying beside her, and no sooner, all the women began to stare with intrigue, sharing tittering whispers amongst themselves.
Mary, Mother of God,
moaned Maud helplessly, his troubled eyes glazed over, finding himself highly aroused, and Basil was quick to notice.
Get a grip!
Basil seethed, whacking Maud with his arm, and quickly catching up behind Alden. They continued to move silently through the never-ending, opulent surroundings, shocked 1,000 times over with every step they took. The endless, winding stone stairways reached dizzying heights. The extravagant architecture bathed in a subtle light, flushed towards the ceiling. It all exhibited the great efforts of the finest craftsmanship.
Surely this can't be my uncle's home.
Basil thought to himself, peering up at the ceilings, spotting more of those mysterious glyphs.
But what if it is?
At last, they had arrived at a very comfortable-looking seating area. Long cushioned sofas sitting on antique Esfahan rugs were scattered precariously throughout. There was nothing Basil wanted more than to rest his weary legs and eat.
Please, you may sit.
Alden offered with a polite hand, Basil listening to the strange accent rolling from his tongue.
Indeed, the two of you must be famished.
And before Basil and Maud had a chance to answer, 3 servant men duly arrived with wooden trays of steaming towels, assorted platters, overloaded with delicious fresh foods, steaming breads, and iced juice beverages. Nodding politely, Basil and Maud wasted no time drinking and eating anything their brazen eyes fell upon. Their thrash bodies were running on empty. Alden, along with the servant men, all bowed simultaneously and stepped away, leaving Basil and Maud to indulge. They did, however, take Basil and Maud's sacks with them. Maud's eyes widened as he watched them walk away.
They just took our sacks,
he exclaimed, stuffing his face with boiled eggs.
Forget about them for now,
replied Basil, taking a glass of water.
Did they just bow for us?
Maud frowned.
I reckon so.
Basil smirked, his words glazed with a hint of tickle.
Strange. Now I don't know where in God's name we've strayed.
Maud shook his head.
But I'm not going anywhere, especially now I've seen those women. Can you believe any of this?
He scoffed quietly, taking a glass of apple juice from the tray.
No, I can't,
replied Basil.
Even in my wildest dreams, I couldn't conjure up a place such as this one. Who the hell is your uncle?
Basil's brain was totally shattered.
I have no idea,
he whispered, dumbfounded.
We don't even know if he's here. Don't even know what he looks like. No one said anything. Lazarus? Stanton?
He sat back and sighed heavily, glancing out into the dark black sea.
We know as much as those rolling waves do out there. Don't even look like we're in Sydney anymore,
Maud replied, continuing to carelessly stuff his cheeks with the delicious foods, carefully spread before them on a carved marble table. Basil shot Maud a condescending look.
What?
Maud shrugged his shoulders defensively. Basil sat for a moment, watching his gluttonous haste.
Really?
He raised a repulsive eyebrow.
I've been hungry even before we left on that bloody ferry to prison, mate.
Maud defiantly held his hands up.
And now all this. May the heathen gods so strike me down.
And strike me down too. Basil laughed, reaching for a hunk of flatbread and swiped it through some fresh, oily hummus. All of a sudden, they heard a door shut behind them, followed by the distant sound of slow and purposeful footsteps. Basil quickly turned over his shoulder, listening to them coming down a dimly lit corridor, lined with arching stone pillars, noticing a silhouette moving toward them. He watched with silent intent as this mystifying silhouette, every so often, caught the glow of an overhead ceiling light, revealing an eloquently striking man with flowing dark hair, donning a silken robe black as night that flailed behind him. The man's authoritative energy pierced through Basil's weary heart, even from a distance. Basil promptly dropped his bread onto a plate and felt a weird anxiety creep over him, and oddly, was compelled to immediately stand to his feet. Noting Basil's swift change in manner, Maud obligingly followed suit without hesitation, although somewhat perplexed. The elusive man, at last, came into view exuding a great strength, yet imparted with an overwhelming sense of calm, and Basil watched a gentle smile form through his impeccably groomed russet beard. He wore loosely fitted linen clothes under his robe, which too were tied with a large burgundy sash. His dark eyes revealed a mysterious depth to them that Basil had not yet witnessed within another human being before. They told of much wisdom and knowledge, gallantry and temperance, fortitude and forgiveness, but most of all, they revealed a many tale of love and pain. The man stood silently, allowing Basil's innocent curiosity to absorb his extraordinary energy. And then he stepped within several feet in front of him, and suddenly dropped to one knee, closing his eyes and whispering utterances. Shocked, Basil glared at Maud, who was just as stunned as he. The man finally rose to his feet, gazing with avid intensity into Basil's dirty and tired face, and immediately thereafter, Basil felt a warm, comforting energy melt through his entire body. Their eyes locked within a pocket of timelessness, and it was within this moment that Basil recognized an eternal bond that was transcendental. He flinched, and his breath gave out. There was no question. Basil knew who this man was.
Basil.
The man's voice gently trembled, pained with intense emotion.
Yes,
Basil murmured, gazing into the man's face.
I am indeed your uncle.
The man spoke eloquently, moving a step closer to him.
Sargon.
Sargon, Basil repeated with a fleeting gasp, staring deep into his uncle's face with wretched emotion. He shuddered. Despite his own mental and physical strength, Basil was no match for his uncle Sargon. The plumes of despairing emotion that had eaten through his heart for a lifetime had now crippled his delirious body, succumbing him to the gallows of an ultimate surrender.
My nephew.
Sargon whispered sympathetically, watching Basil's eyes flutter uncontrollably. The painful absence between the two of them ripped through their devastated hearts, and they embraced each other with desperate affection, an affection starved of a lifetime. Feeling the endless tears streaming from his tired eyes, Basil tried with his might to fight his unyielding emotion, but it was useless, for he was imminently defeated by the wash of buried pain and anguish that gushed so heavily from the depths of his tormented heart like a raging flood. Sargon was Basil's blood, the only family that he had, and someone, from that precise moment onward, he knew that he could trust unconditionally. Meanwhile, Maud stood in total awe. He was unable to move at the sight of this remarkable encounter. Never Had he witnessed his best friend display such intense emotion? It was indeed a rare sight to behold, and he dare not interrupt it. And by now, several men and women throughout the palatial mezzanine noticed the emotional encounter and watched nearby motionless, standing quietly in the shadows. Eventually, Sargon pulled away, grasping Basil by the shoulders as they wiped their tears.
Welcome to Elioth,
He spoke quietly, beaming a radiant smile.
my home.
He turned his attention to Maud.
This is Maud,
Interjected Basil quickly.
my best friend, like a brother.
My deepest salutations to you, Maud.
Sargon nodded warmly, pulling him close to his chest.
How do you do?
Very well, sir.
Maud grinned admirably, touched by his affection.
Thank you for the food.
Ha ha ha, there is plenty more.
Sargon warmly chuckled.
Please do not stop. You must be hungry. I know you have traveled from afar.
Basil and Maud glanced at each other.
How did he know?
They wondered. Sargon glanced over his shoulder.
Ebelan?
He called out, his voice dancing over the high-crafted walls.
Bring the girls.
Within a short moment, 5 gloriously beautiful women, adorned in long floral robes, scampered barefoot towards Sargon, adjusting themselves hurriedly and fixing their flowing black hair.
The women laying in the sunken lounge,
Basil noted. They lined up alongside Sargon politely, and the eldest, perhaps in her mid-40s, and still equally as radiant as the other women, slid her hand gently around Sargon's wrist in a subtle yet doting affection. They all smiled courteously and exuded a worthy manner of grace. Basil saw Maud, on the other hand, struggling at the behests of his lustful attraction, and he did his best to hide it. He was completely struck by their magnificence, for he had never envisaged women like them prior, and subsequently was besotted within an instant.
My beautiful wife and your aunt.
Sargon turned, glancing tenderly at the woman holding his hand.
Ebelan, meet your beloved nephew Basil.
My aunt?
Basil's mind screamed. Ebelan returned her husband's fond tenderness with a stunning wide smile, lined with perfectly white teeth, pressing softly against her rose-colored, succulent lips. She nodded warmly toward Basil. My nephew, it is my great honor to meet you, she purred quietly, a voice so warm that it would melt the coldest ice. Welcome to our home.
And my 4 radiantly beautiful daughters.
Sargon stated proudly, gesturing with his hand further down the line.
And Hedwana, the eldest, followed by Cyrilla, Proseus, and the baby, Farnazra.
He turned his attention to Basil.
They are your cousins.
I have cousins,
Basil thought excitedly.
and beautiful ones. Hello,
Blushed Basil with a big smile, revealing his charming dimples. Our honor, cousin, they murmured politely, bowing slowly. Sargon nodded admirably, revealing his captivating dimples, a family trait.
We are blessed.
He praised with a beatific grin, throwing his hands toward the ceiling.
We have many guests that stay with us. Our doors are open indefinitely to those whom we love and cherish. That includes you.
Get a good night's rest, dear, Ebelan softly spoke, clasping her hands over Basil's. We will see you upon the morrow.
good night, Ebelan.
Smiled Basil, watching the lovely woman quietly slip away through a corridor into the darkness.
Now then,
Sargon began.
we have taken your belongings to your sleeping quarters. You each have warm oiled baths awaiting. Your every need will be honored in my presence.
Uncle, thank you.
Basil bashfully stammered.
I wish I could say something else. Give you some—
Not a word more.
Sargon raised his hand.
It is my great pleasure, believe me.
He placed an affectionate hand on Basil's shoulder.
The hour is late, yes, but I do have one favor to ask you, nephew.
Anything, Uncle.
Basil replied eagerly. Just to say uncle was sheer delight for Basil.
I ask that you join me in my study once you have bathed and refreshed yourself. We have pressing matters to discuss.
Yes, of course, Uncle.
Basil answered without hesitation. Sargon smiled, his curling beard shining in the dim light overhead.
Very well, then. I will excuse myself for the moment.
Sargon leaned in and again embraced both Basil and Maud tenderly. His sincerity was unmistakable, for he was inexpressibly thrilled to have his nephew within the confines of his home. He turned on his bare heel, silently walking away. Basil and Maud stood marveling in total wonder, watching until he had disappeared from view.
I thought life was always going to be black and white for a lad like me,
muttered Maud quietly, his glassy blue eyes drawn to the low crescent moon, kissing the horizon.
But tonight has proven otherwise. This is ridiculous. I know.
Basil whispered flummoxed, also watching the moon.
My mind is not capable of making up such fairy tales. You know this better than anyone, so I know what's happened to us is true. Your Uncle Sargon, is damn strange. But for sure, he is the slickest gent I've ever met in my life.
This way, please.
A quiet voice spoke abruptly from behind, startling them. Whipping their heads around, there was Alden. Despite his wrinkled skin and thinning beard, Alden was rigorous in his manner. He just seemed to pop up out of nowhere. Nodding politely, he swiftly turned, and obediently, Basil and Maud followed silently behind. As they walked through the majesty of a grand rotunda surrounded in Ionic pillars, it was apparent, judging by the great display of wealth blended with priceless antiquity, that no expense had been spared with the creation of this home, right down to the smallest detail. Passing a huge stone figurine in the center, flocked with oiled palms and assorted furniture, made from animal hide and camphor wood, Basil and Maud shared a grin. For only a few hours before were they almost certainly toast, besieged by merciless prison guards, and now they had entered into a realm of unmatched affluence and inexorable luxury. And at that very moment, Basil could not have felt more awkward. His mind was awash of confusion and relief. Relief that his uncle wasn't the monster he had assumed he could have been, and confused because his uncle was nothing even remotely like his father. The only similarity they had was their brown eyes. He glanced down at the mosaic-tiled floor, admiring the meticulous geometry apparent in every cleft, shaking his head.
Do please enter.
Alden's smiling face glinted within the flames of torchieres, guiding the two of them between the huge Revanala palms into a wide, groin-vault corridor, quickly shunning out the rest of Alioth. Wandering several yards behind their old chaperone, The corridor took the two of them to another opulent quarter of the home. Basil glimpsed through some towering windows to his left, and he noticed an expansive balcony that descended into luscious, multi-tiered gardens, nestled along high sea cliffs. The verdant gardens grew over statuettes and pillars that scattered over manicured lawns, which in turn lined an extraordinarily long pool, bathing in the subtle moon shadow. Basil tapped Maud on the arm.
Fancy a swim? That's got to be at least a half a mile long,
Maud answered, peering out.
Welcome to your sleeping quarters.
Alden smiled quietly, drawing to the entrance of two mammoth doors.
Thank you,
Nodded Basil, peering around the dimly lit corridor. Alden duly opened the doors, gesturing Maud into the left and Basil into the right. Once Basil stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him. He turned over his shoulder for a moment, met with total silence. Alone I am, he thought, for the first time in a long time. He sighed deeply, quickly relinquishing himself within the grandness of his quarters. Walking through, he let his eyes wander from the stone-carved king-size bed to the floor-length windows that fell upon the glistening ocean. Platters of exotic fruits, assorted seafood and steaming rice were spread out along a wooden table in the living area. He took a fresh date from the fruit platter and squeezed it into his mouth, and had a gander at the walk-in closet, complete with an array of caftans, robes, trousers and slippers, all in perfect order. Nothing had been left to chance. An appeased grin formed across Basil's lips. My Uncle Sargon, he thought, closing his eyes. Who would have guessed? He flung off his dirty clothes and kicked off his boots and stepped into the colossal bathing area, equipped with a sunken bath inlaid with amethyst. Oh, how I've missed you, he muttered drearily, slipping into the warm, oily water, letting out a relieving moan of pleasure as his body melted with relaxation. He dropped his head back, glancing at a wooden tray of various oils, salts, and soaps in clay pots, and happily closed his eyes. His mind drifted to beautiful things. The woman on the Adriatic. He opened his eyes, staring out into the shimmering horizon, remembering her radiance, remembering her mere touch, the crashing waves, the blinding light, those icy, violet eyes. Please, please come back to me, Basil silently begged, letting out an exasperated breath. Suddenly, he heard a knock at the door.
Who is it?
He jolted upright quickly, his sacred thoughts rudely snatched away from him.
Me, stupid!
Basil rolled his head back. Oh, perfect timing, he mumbled to himself. The sounds of scuffling feet drew closer to the bathroom.
Wow!
Maud gasped, wearing nothing but a towel.
These views are amazing.
Basil glanced up at him. Are you talking about me, or? Maud squeezed a meek smile through his lips and sat down on the edge of the bath, tinkering his legs in the water. Huh, lucky sods we are, Basil said, laying back with his eyes closed. That was a speedy bath.
I haven't had one yet,
said Maud, rubbing his chin.
Well, you're sure as hell not having one in here. I'm brimming with questions.
Maud rushed eagerly, totally ignoring Basil.
Mate, I don't know who the hell your uncle is, but Jesus, do you know any other crims living up this kind of lifestyle?
I don't know anyone living up this kind of lifestyle. Basil glanced at Maud's steaming face.
Let alone crims. You know as much as me, mate. All I know is that he is someone. But how can one man have such wealth like this? Maybe he's a milkman.
Maud suggested wryly.
You know, the sticky kind. I doubt it.
Basil dismissed quickly.
Then what?
Well, Basil wiped his face.
Just by the way he looked at me, I know he has a sharper moral than that. And look at the way he dresses, his voice, the way he speaks, the guards, the statues, the antiques, the glyphs on the wall. There's something very odd about him, as if he lives within a different world. And whatever it is, I think it's safe to say that you and I don't have the faintest clue about him. I'm not about to start guessing either. Oh, and his daughters,
drooled Maud, his eyes beginning to roll like marbles.
Caw! Look, I'm gonna enjoy this. I'm gonna eat till I'm fatted like a lamb, take me bath, and get the hell on to sleep and have many promiscuous dreams about these gorgeous beauties. I have never in me life ever seen such finer.
Basil shot Maud a cold glance.
You just remember whose cousins they are.
Maud laughed, tightening his towel.
What a bollocks of a day.
He shook his head with disbelief.
It's been a nutter for sure,
snickered Basil, flicking water at his face.
Go on, get going. I've got to get dressed to meet my uncle now.
Maud flicked a handful of water back into Basil's face and quickly scurried out of sight before Basil could retaliate.
Let me know how it goes,
he called over his shoulder. Rubbing his wet ebony locks with a towel, Basil quickly sat down beside those sumptuous platters and gobbled some salmon and rice with his hungry fingers. He glimpsed out through those spacious windows, following the long line of glowing lights sprawled all over Sargon's property. Basil could now see that the home itself was perched on the edge of a cliff face, stretching at least a mile, not to mention all the landscape gardens clambering along the other cliffs as far as the eye could see. And then to the northeast was several little apostles, all linked together by very high, arching bridges to the mainland. It was immaculate design. Basil swallowed a gulp of water and walked into the closet, and despite the clothing appearing to be styled for another age, they were far more comfortable looking than his own clothes. Choosing a navy tunic and trousers to match, he hastily dressed and flicked back his wet hair with his fingers and quietly trod out of his sleeping quarters to go and meet this mysterious Uncle Sargon, and barefoot.